The war rooms are raging. They're raging hard, and the entire world is turning into a tinderbox. And we're going to talk about it. I want to talk about the Israel-Palestine war, which seems to be escalating at a rapid clip, and the Ukrainian-Russian war. It doesn't give me much pleasure to talk about this, but I love geopolitics too much, way too much, for me not to want to muse upon it. And this is the canvas upon which we do our musing, so to speak. Let's start with the Israel-Palestine war. Things escalating. Israel, they fought this outburst. I don't want to, regurgitate some of the news from the last few days, but the state of the affairs are that Israel seems to be insistent upon a ground invasion in Lebanon and threatening Hezbollah entirely. And if that were to happen, Iran would want to protect its proxy by attacking Israel from the south. And if that were to happen, if that were to escalate, then Israel would ask for, and America would not be able to deny. And we're going to get to why they wouldn't be able to deny. Well, it's because of AIPAC, right? American politicians, all of them are bought and sold for. Be it Donald Trump, be it Kamala Harris, be it Joe Biden, the AIPAC lobby, the Israeli lobby, it's one of the most powerful in the American Senate, and it has a disproportionate effect on American decision making when it comes to Israel. We're going to get to all of that. I want to talk about how important America's revealed to be has become in the last many months, right? Biden, he just admitted that he wanted Netanyahu to go for a ceasefire with Lebanon, but they chose to attack Lebanon instead. You would never expect an American president to be ignored willy-nilly like that. America has not been able to advance the two-state solution at all, or even push for any ceasefire. They have been failing, and every single day we know obviously the moral failings, allowing the bloodshed to happen, allowing this to happen while doing the cover-up. People are going to lose. When I say people, I mean Americans. Americans are going to lose faith in the government more than they have in the last many decades. And at some point it's going to be the last straw. And the public seems to be getting ever closer to that last straw. I want to talk about the best case scenario. I want to talk about the worst case scenario, the best case scenario, and the most likely scenario of where I see these wars going, based on my models of the world, my very crude heuristics. I haven't done a ton of reading. I've done, very minimal reading into the subject matter. But based on when the winds are flowing, based on what the incentives are, based on how the players are sat both on the chess board, I think the best case scenario is that US is able to pressure Israel into having a ceasefire at the earliest date, maybe as early as in the next few weeks, by pulling the levers of no more aid for Israel until they do agree to that. Because a lot of the fighting which is happening is being is being paid for by the American taxpayers. And if one politician with some spine gets up, starts a movement that no more supporting a government which is insistent on self-preservation, because what Netanyahu is doing is not good for Israel. No Israel who's intellectually honest is going to be able to say with any shred of honesty that what Netanyahu has done, what the government has done over the last year since the 7th of October has been in Israel's favor. Not just from the moral standpoint, it's been despicable, it's been disgusting, but even from a purely security standpoint, I'm surprised that they haven't lost more Arab partners, because that's the direction that they were heading in, a very dark direction indeed. But I don't know if it's a majority of the Israeli public, but they realize that what Bibi Netanyahu has done is for self-preservation. It's not good for Israel long term. It's not good for people who care about other people, even if those other people are across the border, right? And a lot of Israeli people feel the pain of Palestinian people because they've experienced the same at the hands of Hamas militants, terrorists. And what he's done is obviously, I don't think that anyone can argue against those being some of those things being war crimes. I support the Israel project wholeheartedly. I think they need to have security. They need to have their, like, not just they need to, but they should have their own nation. But there's a way to go about it. There's a way to, and the way was pretty clear. The two-state solution was always. Again, I don't want to get into those historical details because that would keep us talking for the next 5 hours. I don't have time for that. You don't have time for that. I don't have the appetite for that. What I want to talk about is again the best case scenario. So what happens is that the Arab partners, the US, they get into a coalition. They pressure Israel to, and the carrot can be partnerships with obviously these are aligned Arab partners who say that if you do a ceasefire and if you do a two-state solution, expedited two-state solution, let's say in a month we've got a Palestinian nation. Forget about everything that's happened in the past, because if we keep on using the past as a pretext, then we'll never get out of this cycle of violence, right? We have to have a clean break at some point. Yeah, the wounds are raw. It's been devastating for people on both sides, but I think this is the argument that people, visionary leaders could make on that side, people who care about stopping this madness, stopping this before it escalates into, well, something that we don't want to imagine, right? And so they can get together with reasonable Israeli partners and reasonable Palestinian partners, get everyone on the table. America says, okay, we're not going to support you, Israel, anymore, unless you're willing to do an unless you obviously ceasefire as a first step and then a two-state solution at the most rapid clip, which satisfies, in a way that satisfies all the things that you would want, right? So Israel, obviously, they care about security, and that can happen. We're going to get to that in a second. But yeah, so the nature of this would be that they get together, the two-state solution is implemented at speed, and the discussion is that the thorny issues, for example, with the mosque, with access to the mosque from the West Bank side, some of the other thorny issues, they can be settled at a later date. But what we want to do right now is that Palestine gets a nation, Israel gets a nation, and we've got Arab partners who, for some time, give security assurances to both the parties. And Gaza is rebuilt with Saudi money, with UAE money, and on the condition of providing security guarantee to Israel, such that all the borders or everything's controlled by some private contractors from the Middle Eastern side, from the aligned Arab partners. So it could be some Saudi private public partnerships or companies that handle all the security, all the border inflows and outflows, such that no rockets can come in, no guns can come in, no weapons can come in. There's heavy surveillance. That's one of the conditions which has to be set up on the Gaza side. But everywhere we've got this heavy surveillance, like China, so Israel can keep an eye on proceedings. That gives them the assurance that things are happening in the way that would satisfy our security assurance condition. As I said, Gaza's border control is handled independently. And what about providing security assurance to Gaza? The US support to Israel is contingent upon Gaza obviously becoming its own independent nation, and Israel, and then the US forcing Israel or incentivizing Israel, and then the Arab partners incentivizing Israel to set up trade partnerships, relationships with Gaza. Because trade, we have seen this throughout history, trade deters wars. And Israel also has to front significant reconstruction costs. They simply have to. I mean, they didn't have to, level the entire place, and it's just morally right for them to do that. And they also have to be involved in providing vocational training and some educational training and helping set up some hospitals, universities, things that because they would be involved, they can, be involved in a way that can incentivize the younger generation, the younger Palestinian generation, to go beyond the Hamas education of wanting to destroy Israel to wanting to, build a better world, wanting to live harmoniously with the neighbors, with Israeli people, having mutual respect for everyone, for Israeli people, wanting to move beyond. Because So they can be part of that process, and that would be a win-win for all the parties involved. And then obviously this would be contingent upon elections in Israel. This would almost require elections in Israel happening at the earliest stage. And Netanyahu, he's given a shellacking. He's thrown in prison for the war crimes that he's committed and for the corruption charges that he's inevitably going to go in the jail for. And a liberal, a visionary, someone who's inclined towards peace and progress, takes over in a landslide and with a mandate that allows that person to do everything that we've spoken about, helping making Israel front some of the cause, making Israel a part of the rebuilding process, setting up the faculties, the facilities, all sorts of things. And this also in a way incentivizes or almost pushes a regime change in Iran, because Iran was one of the Iranian government was one of the key culprits behind a lot of this festering. And somehow if this leads to a regime change, I don't see a direct path, but there's obviously a lot of discontent among the Persian people, and if they see that Israel wants to go on this path, Israel wants to support Palestinian rebuilding, wants to support a two-state solution, the new generation of Israeli leaders, then Iranian people would be more likely to go to start a revolution, and that could topple the government, that could end the theocratic madness that has engulfed the beautiful Iranian nation for the last 50 years. And that could be the end of the funding and a lot of the root causes that were behind Hamas and Hezbollah and even the Syrian wars, etc. So this would be the best case scenario. It could happen as quickly as 2 months, right? You just need willing leaders, visionary leaders. You just need you need someone on the American side, someone like I don't want to give a name. I don't want to politicize this, but I don't see any person apart from maybe someone like AOC, who has the guts, has the spine to set up an American coalition that can force the Americans to stop taking money from the Israeli lobby and then do what's right for the greater many rather than just for the the military industrial complex, right? So someone like that from the American side, and then some secular liberal leader from the Israeli side who's winning the election and who's like, okay, we gotta push for the two-state solution, and he's able to talk with the Israeli people in a way that makes the Israeli people feel the pain, some of the pain that people in the Palestinian side have felt. Because what the Israelis felt on the 7th of October is what the Palestinians have felt every single day for the last 1 year. And people are quick to forget that, but we shouldn't, right? No pain should be minimized. Like, pain is pain. Heartbreak, losing your loved ones, it is. I don't want to equalize obviously what Hamas is a terrorist organization. Israel, obviously they did what they thought was, they just went overboard. There's no doubt about it. And so my point is that there's pain on both sides. That's the argument that I'm making. That's the argument that the Israeli government leader has made. That there's pain on both sides. But we cannot get trapped in this cycle of, eye for an eye, because that's just going to make us both blind. Israel is suffering in a lot of ways. It's become an international pariah. There are 1.5 billion Muslim people who hate Israel, and a lot of young liberal people that hate Israel. People are turning anti-Semitic on both sides. There are obviously anti-Semitic people on the far right. They're far gone. But at least on the left side, at least on the liberal side, a lot of those are not foregone conclusions. The only reason for the anti-Semitism is because Israel has been an apartheid state. Israel has been operating in a way that is not conducive to dignified living. And so if Israel is able to, if some leadership in Israel is able to, have a clean break from that kind of harmful, detrimental way of operating and dealing with Gaza and Palestine, and set up a new modality of interacting, then I think a lot of people would feel differently about Israel. And I want what's best for the Israeli people. I want what's best for the Palestinian people. What I'm biased for in this situation is, reducing human suffering. That's simply it. So that would be the best case scenario. in the worst case scenario, what happens is that Israel, I haven't followed the news in the last few days, but last I checked, there were missiles fired at Israel by Iran, and then Israel was looking at what they want to do in their retaliation, and they were looking at some nuclear strikes as one of the options, oil rigs another option, right? And those were the top two things. Now Netanyahu, it's no secret that he wants to get America involved because he knows America, because the politicians that bought and sold for, they'll be beholden to get, if Israel is attacked physically, they'll be by Iran. They will almost compel the Americans to get involved, even at the level of the ground, right? At the level of the American troops. And so he wants to do that because he wants to topple the Iranian government for once and for all. And so he probably would be more inclined to, he's more hawkish on that side. He probably would want to attack both the nuclear sites and the oil rigs. If that were to happen, then Iran would obviously, I mean, they are no slouches. They got probably the strongest, after Israel, or maybe right next to Israel, they're probably the strongest military in the Middle East, and probably the top 5 to top 10 militaries in the entire world. And so if that were to happen, and they've obviously got a lot of air power, so that would mean that a war breaks out between Iran and Israel, and that's not going to be good for anyone involved. And yeah, the US has to be involved at the level of the troops being involved, and there's a lot of bloodshed, there's a lot of carnage. I don't know how that ends. It wouldn't end anytime soon, because Israel would probably want to see the regime change. They would want to go to the end, to the degree that the Iranian government is so crippled that the regime change becomes almost inevitable. While for Iran, they would realize that this is a one shot, because things are already, there's a flurry of missiles being thrown at each other. This is their one chance of having the killer blow. They would never be able to do that, but in the delusions of the Khomeini, they probably would think that this is the one chance that we have to take Israel down for once and forever. And so this war would last for some time. And because Iran is supported by China, they've got trade partners in China and Russia, they wouldn't really worry too much about being sanctioned. So yeah, I think that war would probably continue for maybe a couple of years, until one of them realized that this is not taking us anywhere, like they're just being trapped in this. And yeah, there's a ceasefire. And again, these are not neighbors, so I think it probably wouldn't last for 2 years, because these are not neighboring countries. I think the distance between the two is like 1,000 miles. Is it 1,000? I don't think it's 1,000 miles. It's like 600 miles of Iraq in between the two. And yeah, so that could be, Iran could potentially send ground troops, because if Iran can convince Iraq to let the territory be used as a base of attack, then they probably would be willing to. Because Iraq, obviously, they also would love to see Israel being toppled. So I think that's how it would play out then. Then Iraq would allow Iran to use them as a launch pad, and then there would be a ground incursion into Israel, and there'd be ground fighting. Now Iran has numerical superiority in terms of the ground troops, but the problem with that scenario is that they'll need to send a meaningful number of troops to the fighting. If they do that, then that leaves security vulnerabilities at home, and they don't have a great situation at home, right? So yeah, that would make for fertile grounds for a revolution to happen. So that would be interesting to see. But this would also mean that if America becomes involved in this war, then China senses, many American military experts were saying that the optimal time for China to attack Taiwan would be somewhere in late 2026. And so China would probably bring those plans closer and decide that, okay, America's involved in 2 wars. This is the best time for us to attack Taiwan. And they do that. And yeah, so that could be the worst case scenario. I think the most likely scenario is that Israel and Lebanon, they throw more rockets at each other. Now, Hamas, obviously, they are not going to be defeated. Israel gets that big time. There's obviously been pressure building up on Netanyahu, because they know that the hostages are not coming home anytime soon. Now, they're not coming home at all. and so pressure's building up on having an election sometime soon. So yeah, Israel and Lebanon, they exchange some more rockets, and in the next few months, Israel loses a few thousand soldiers in a ground incursion. Lebanon loses tens of thousands of Hezbollah militants, and their military capabilities are severely degraded. And this is very costly for both the sides. And they decide, and then there's a plateau in terms of how many more the gains, just as there's been a plateau for Russia and Ukraine. There will be a plateau if the war were to take this route, which I think is the most likely route. And so both of the parties have said that this is a ripe time for ceasefire, and they have a ceasefire. Israel sets up more military bases in the north to act as a deterrent, and yeah. And then sometime next year, people are very tired. They force an election. Netanyahu loses the election, and then there's a ceasefire in Gaza. The Arab partners intervene, and they push for the two-state solution. And yeah, two-state solution is implemented over the next 6 months. And this is the most likely scenario. Now let's move on to the Ukrainian-Russian war. Before we talk about the best case scenario, the worst case, and the most likely, I want to talk about, because it's the election season, I want to talk about what I think would happen with a Trump win and what I would think would happen with a Harris win. Let's start with Trump. If he wins, Ukraine has to concede. I mean, every single thing that he's talked about, every single indication that he's given, it just seems that he's going to obviously pull the plug on Ukraine, on the funding, on all the aid, etc. He seems to be very supportive of dictatorial regimes, and yeah, he would pull the plug. And Ukraine, without American assistance, doesn't really have to. It's just clear as daylight, right? It just doesn't have the legs to continue fighting. And so if they were to continue fighting, it wouldn't really make sense for them. Like, they would lose more territory. And so what Trump would suggest, which is a ceasefire, which is the end of the war, would actually, even though in the short term it seems like the worst case scenario for Ukraine, would be the best case scenario. And yeah, it would seem like the worst case scenario because the hand will, for them, obviously from their perspective, it would feel like the hand has been forced. They wanted to continue fighting for longer until they freed up some more territory, but no one's getting the absolute aims, right? Absolutist aims. So that's just delusions. But in the longer term, because of the tens of thousands of lives that would end up being saved because of this path, because of the ending of war at the earliest point, because of that counterfactual, and again, those tens of thousands of lives would have been lost for no net gains virtually. And yeah, over time, this will seem to have become not a best case scenario, but the most reasonable option, the only real option on which to build a platform of rapid growth with Western partners, with allied partners that would want to see a prosperous Ukraine. NATO doesn't have to be the only bulwark, right? Prosperity can be an equally strong force. More prosperity brings more tech, it brings more innovation, more trading partners, more interdependence, more military might, which might be a deterrent, which might be as strong a deterrent to future Russian aggression as NATO might be. I think it would be even more of a. I do think that a stronger, more prosperous Ukraine would be a greater deterrent to future Russian aggression than NATO. And the reason for that is that NATO is not as tight-knit a community, as many people make it out to be. Sure, there's the Article 5, but do we really think that, Turkish soldiers would go to defend Ukrainian territory if Russia were to attack Ukraine once it's become part of NATO, right? Not just that, but even a lot of Americans might disagree with, the Article 5. That was incorporated during different times, during different geopolitical climate. But I don't think that too many countries would be too keen about Article 5 anymore. Like, they want to, it's in their interest from a game theoretic perspective to want to say that, okay, this is our sacred article. But if you look at it from a self-interested perspective, Like the way to think about this is, if you're a Finland, if you're a Sweden, if you're a Greece, if you're a Turkey, it makes sense for you to want to say that I support this, because the odds are that you won't actually have to send your troops to another nation. But if your nation gets attacked by another nation that is not NATO, then you know that your allies are going to come in, because you said that you're going to support Article 5. You know your allies, NATO allies, are going to swoop in to protect you. So just from a purely game theoretic perspective, it makes sense for you to say that you support it, even though you know that when the rubber meets the road, you're not going to commit your troops to the fighting. So from that perspective, I think a stronger, more prosperous Ukraine is more of a deterrent to future Russian aggression, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 5 years, than NATO would be. So from that perspective, I think a Trump win, even though in the short term it's not great, in the longer term, I think it works out for them. It also, takes away the illusions that NATO membership might give to Ukraine, right? Because if you got NATO membership, you don't need to spend a ton of money because you got the security umbrella. But if you know that you're the only country, well, you're the only person, or you're the only nation responsible, you're the only entity responsible for your self-preservation, then yeah, that's going to make you be more sensible, be more proactive, be more agile, be more thoughtful, and be more powerful in your defense, in your posture, right? Like the best example of this is, had America not lied, America and the UK not lied, and other European nations for that matter, not lied about, providing security umbrella protection to Ukraine if they gave up their nuclear weapons, then Ukraine would be in a very different situation right now. But they relied on foreign partners, right? So I hope that they don't make that mistake again. And it's the same mistake with NATO. It's just, different arrangement. But at the end of the day, even though NATO Article 5 stipulates that, what we got to think about is that these are very low P events, low probability events. And so the calculus is very different, right? They know that it's not going to happen. So I'm fine. Like, I'm happy saying that I'm going to commit my troops, because I know that my troops are not actually ever going to be needed in the theater of war. But in the odd chance that they are needed to protect me, then I'll got that protection. So yeah, so Ukraine has to learn that lesson. They have to become self-reliant, and they can be, right? They've got some really smart people, some really hardworking people. They've got some of the best developers, some of the best tech people. They've obviously got a lot of goodwill. A lot of countries would love to, even countries like China, they would love to invest in Ukraine. We're going to talk about all of that in a second. But yeah, if they choose the path of self-sufficiency, which is the path that they should choose to set up a bulwark against future Russian aggression, then they're going to be in a pretty decent place in the future. Then let's talk about Kamala Harris win. If she wins, it's a short-term win, because Ukraine, obviously, they want to continue fighting. This means that the support is continued. But this is a long-term loss, because the war continues. Ukrainians lose soldiers by the hundreds every day. Some accounts say that they're losing 1,000 soldiers a day. I didn't believe that for a second, but they could have 1,000 casualties, but certainly not 1,000 deaths. But even 100 deaths a day for more than a couple of years, I mean, that is heartbreaking, right? We become so hardened. I remember I cried when I read about the Israeli thing. I remember I cried when I read about the Palestinian thing. I remember I cried when I read about and was watching videos about Ukrainian thing. Over time, your heart just hardens. It has to, right? Because it's a good thing and a bad thing. But yeah, it doesn't affect me emotionally as much as it did back in the day to talk about these things. I'm talking in such clinical terms. And I'm actually surprised. Because the last time I was talking about Ukraine over here on this canvas, I remember I shed a few tears, but I don't think that we got into the emotions. It's just taking a bird's eye view, a clinical zoomed up view. If I actually looked at the reports, I think that would still move people to tears. It certainly would move me to tears. But yeah, this is not that conversation. This is a conversation about what are the most likely scenarios, and well, the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, and the most likely scenarios. And yeah, so Harris win, it's a short-term win. but it's a long-term loss because they don't make any appreciable gains in terms of territory. We've seen this in the last year, haven't gained back any territory. If you go back a year, well, a couple of years back, right at the start of the war, they could have had a ceasefire, they could have had an ending of the war with the same terms, right? That, okay, we got all this territory, we haven't lost too many soldiers yet, and all we need to do is say that we'll never join NATO. Had done that, but Boris Johnson, in his stupidity, in his I mean, the words that you can use, the choice words that you can use for Boris Johnson, the bozo. Yeah. And his arrogance and his desire to play God, he was like, yeah, no, Ukraine, you gotta fight till death. And I've heard other people talk about this. Who else was talking about this? That Ukraine should fight till death. Yeah, Piers Morgan, another madman, right? I mean, in what universe is fighting to the death the right thing? When you know that you can get back in the game in the future if you make the right moves now. Like, back in the past, when, you had these civilizational wars, battles, when you had these empires fighting against each other, and you had these codes of honor and codes of, like, if my empire falls, then my entire identity is attached to my empire, right? If it falls, I'm done for. Like, those things don't apply in this world anymore. And to live by those stupid, short-sighted ways and modes of thinking, it's just so frustrating for me to see. And that's the kind of thing which makes Ukraine think that, what we are doing is the right thing. But they're destroying the future of the... Again, I don't want to speak on their behalf. I don't want to, But if I was a Ukrainian, I'm not, evidently, but if I was one, I would value self-preservation, because self-preservation is what allows me to win the game over a longer time. The first rule to win any game is to continue to exist, and that's what they're threatening. Right. So anyway, so it would be a long-term loss because they would have lost tens of thousands of more people. They would have lost a lot more infra for no gains, virtually any gains. And the refugees, they would have lived outside the country for such a long time that many of them are not going to return back. And at some point in the next 3-4 years, further war becomes untenable for both sides, and then a ceasefire happens. But it happens at significantly worse terms because a lot more people have died for nothing. A lot more infrastructure has been destroyed. Billions and hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure has been destroyed. And yeah. Unless, obviously, the Kamala Harris admin decides or is willing to cross the red lines of allowing Ukraine to use some of the American weapons and allow the American administration to lend some of its weapons, or even donate some of its military aircrafts, F-21s, stealth bombers, etc., to use them to attack the Russian territory. But based on everything that I've seen, because this would allow, if you can hit the Russians where it hurts the most, which is in their land, and this is only possible with American equipment and with American permission and with American airplanes, right? I think that knowing the incentives, knowing the risk factors, knowing the fear factor, I don't think that's likely. And so, based on what's likely, with the Kamala Harris admin, it wouldn't be a great thing for Ukraine. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the best case scenario. In this case, unlike the last one, in which my best case scenario was for both the parties involved in the war, Israel and Palestine, in this case, I'm very much biased. I want Ukraine to win. And so my best case scenario here is obviously from that perspective, from a Ukrainian perspective, rather than from a dual perspective. What's good for both Israel and Palestine, or what's good for both Israel and Russia. So the best case scenario for Ukraine is that the war is over at the earliest date. There's a ceasefire, and then there's a discussion of longer term truce and ending of war, the ending of hostilities, and then Ukraine starts rebuilding using frozen Russian funds, which total $600 billion, if I know my figures, and Western partners are willing to invest a ton of money into Ukraine. Even countries like Russia, China, not Russia, but China and India, they invest a ton of money, and yeah, Ukraine gets rebuilt at a very rapid click, and yeah, they modernize their military, which acts. They become less dependent on personnel, more dependent on drones, modern warfare. And they do all of this using as I said, Russian funding and loans from America, etc. And they set up partnerships with military contractors like Anduril, etc., to set up these deterring forces, such that they don't have to be reliant on anyone else in the future. And always the best case for Ukraine would be joining NATO, but I think that's a precondition to the best case. They either join NATO or they're on a path of joining NATO. But even if they don't, as I said, if they become self-sufficient, I think that would be a great deterrent to Ukraine, to Russia. And yeah, in this case, obviously, Russia, they get the land because they get the land, Ukraine gets NATO membership, they get help for rebuilding, get $600 billion for rebuilding, even more. And they have a pathway to a strong, modern military that can repel the worst case scenarios in the future. Be so strong that they fear attacking you. Be the warrior in the garden. Both are somewhat happy, but no one gets absolutist aims, which was impossible in the first place. People who care for or who want absolutist aims don't live in the real world. People there are not too many of those people. Well, one of the things which has prompted this discussion, which has been very interesting, is it's just a side note, but interesting side note. So, John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, they were on a podcast. Well, they were on the All In Summit recently, and I heard their conversation, I listened intently to that conversation 2 times actually, and you see both of them agree very much with the situation in Ukraine, but they disagree when it comes to China, because Mearsheimer, he's been groomed, he's been trained in the school of old school anarchic game theoretic dynamics, and Jeffrey Sachs, he wants to move closer, or he's got visions of a more, I wouldn't even say utopian, but more utopian leaning world, where people can live more, even great powers can live more harmoniously. We have never seen evidence of that, and that's why John Mearsheimer has the position that he has. But that was a very interesting contrast, and yeah, so that was an interesting aside that I wanted to add, that, there are various schools of thought of where these situations might be heading towards, and 2 of the more radical ones, obviously, 2 of the more articulate positions are those of Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer. The worst case scenario in this situation is the war continues on for years and years, and Ukraine ceases to exist as a nation over time. No one's coming back. Most of the young people have ended up dying or have ended up leaving. Most of the children have left completely. Only old people are there, and they're obviously going to die over the next few decades. And over a decade-long period, Russia has engulfed Ukraine completely, cut by cut. And this encourages Xi, who's been dictatorial dreaming and who's been unchallenged for a long time, to go on his own crusade, and the world gets into boiling water before we know it. And nuclear weapons are fired at each other. So that's the worst case scenario. It could very well happen, by the way. People like David Sachs, the All-In people, I think, the last pod they were talking about this, I think these are overblown fears. Very unlikely that this happens, but because the costs are so astronomical, basically the end of human civilization, the end of the human civilizational project, the concerns are warranted. So I get that. What is the most likely scenario? I think the best case scenario is the most likely scenario over here, and that obviously shows my optimism and my bias, but the sooner the war is over, the better. And yeah, and that happens if Trump wins. And that's very funny. It's ironic that someone who doesn't give a damn about Ukraine, we saw that, when Zelensky and Ukraine, Zelensky and Trump, they were standing next to next, side by side. You could see that Trump does not give a damn about Ukraine. He's got no compassion in the way he speaks about the bloodshed, about the carnage. He obviously doesn't care about it, right? He's a narcissistic, he lacks empathy, we all know that. But what's ironic is that the person who doesn't care about Ukraine might end up being and creating the best case scenario for Ukraine. Funny how that works out, isn't it? Someone who lacks in compassion and lacks in empathy might be the solution to the most compassionate path forward. The cosmic joke is somewhere in there. That's just so funny. If Harris wins, on the other hand, the best case scenario is Ukraine gets more weapons and the war continues for a year or some more time, and then Russia realizes no more point in fighting further. It's just too many lives have been lost. It's just been insane damages. It's the end of the war, and then the hostilities end, and money and resources start flowing to Ukraine over the span of 3-4 years. Ukraine starts getting rebuilt, and Ukraine becomes Japan 2.0, only faster. So yeah, that's in the Harris administration. But I think this best case scenario with the Harris one still leads to like tens of thousands of more people losing lives, both Russian and Ukrainian, right? We don't want to minimize Russian lives lost just because they're fighting from the Russian standpoint. Because a lot of people who fight, they're brainwashed. Most of the Russian soldiers who are fighting, they didn't hate Ukrainians. They have just been brainwashed into fighting this barbaric war. So I don't want to minimize the loss of life on the Russian side either. The only barbaric people are the Russian government and the Russian leadership. And obviously there are lots of barbaric people in the Russian military too, even some people on the front lines. But I would think that most of the people want to live in peace and harmony. If this were to, I want to take I want to zoom out again and look at the global perspective and see what happens. China, if all of this were to materialize, again, China would probably be more emboldened. Well, if some of these things that we discussed were to materialize, China would be more emboldened, seeing that America is occupied and they invade Taiwan. They lose a ton of people. But because Xi is far gone mentally, I've seen this trend with dictators. If you look at history, dictators say start off well because most nations have got obvious problems. But you need someone with a strong will, a strong spine, and someone who's willing to take the hard decisions. And usually that tends to be people who are not chosen electorally, because electorally, most people, the mass, the hoi polloi, they don't want to make the hard decisions, right? They don't want to like people who want to make the hard decisions. So that's why, for example, with Hitler, right? I need to brush up on my history with Hitler, but I think he was elected in Germany, right? And then he became a dictator. So what happens is that, this kind of disproves my point, but my point was that dictators, the reason they're effective early on is that they're able to make those meaningful changes, those radical. We can look at Javier Milei, who's obviously not a dictator, who's chosen democratically, but he speaks to the broad point I'm making, that sometimes we need people from the outside who are willing to make the hard decisions that most people would not support, even though those decisions are in their favor in the longer term. And dictators are really good at that because they're disagreeable. They've got long-term vision. They don't really care about just serving people. They care about long-term survival and thriving of the nation, right? Hitler, who was the most, again, you can use your choices adjectives, the most heinous person on the planet, the top 5 worst humans on the planet in history. Yeah, sure, all of that's fine. We agree to all of that, but you can't deny the fact that he wanted the best for German people. Like, he cared about German people, right? He had a vision for the German people. And so dictators are really good at that. Same with Xi Jinping, same with Stalin, same with most dictators in history, most kings in history. Like, they wanted the best for their people. And so Xi Jinping would want the best for his people, and he sees that, yeah, Taiwan is a way to, reunification is the best thing for my people. So he could be so gone, like he would be willing to. Yeah. So again, sorry. My point was that dictators are really good at making some of those hard, necessary choices early on, but over time, obviously, the complexity, the landscape changes, and so their solution, like they were able to implement the early solutions to the problems that existed at the time that they got into power. But then the nature of the problems changed. But at that point, because they're not being questioned, because they cannot be challenged, they cannot be questioned, they usually come to the wrong conclusions. They come to the wrong ideas, the wrong solutions. And so they end up becoming less and less effective. They end up becoming more and more self-sabotaging for themselves. Well, forget about for themselves, but for the nation. You've seen this throughout history. And so I think that's what would happen with, that's what might happen with Xi Jinping. I'm not saying it would certain to happen, but it could happen. So yeah, he, decides to go for it. He's not being challenged, and he's just, he's he put someone who criticized him for, allowing China to go into demographic crisis. He basically made this person disappear. He was an economist, I think, this person that I'm referring to. And he made this person disappear. It was a very valid point, right? Xi Jinping has been in power for the last 10-15 years. China's demographic destiny was not written in stone, right? They could have reversed the course. Like, sure, one-child policy, that's fine for some time. But there's a point in time, and it was 15 years back, that they could have realized, okay, now we can turn on the two-child policy, or, you can have as many as you want, but have 2 children. That's the best thing for your nation, if you want to be of service, if you want to do the patriotic thing. So have 2 children. If you have 3, that's fine. Or, whatever policy they want to set up, right? But just moving on from that and setting up incentives to move towards a 2-child policy, 2.1 fertility rate policy, basically. So, yeah, but he didn't realize it early on. Maybe some people might have brought it to his attention, because China, obviously, they've got 100 million people in government. They've got some of the smartest people on the planet. So just by sheer numbers, you would imagine that some of those people in the government, even the governments by definition, by definition, but by default, they tend to dissuade smart, ambitious people, forget about ambitious, but smart people to want to join them. They're still by sheer numbers. Reminds me of that silly thing that Mark Zuckerberg said in the opening scene of The Social Network, where he says that China's got more geniuses than America's entire population. I think that's true. Well, I know that's not true. I mean, I know for a fact. But yeah, I'm not sure why he would have said that. If you look at the bell curves, and so this is the American bell curve and this is the Chinese bell curve, right? I mean, yeah, okay, it's better. On your left, you got the Chinese. On your right, you got the Chinese. And on your left, you got the American. Now, obviously, the edges go all the way, right? Edges on the right. So it's not completely grounded in what we are looking at. My point is that even with 1.4 billion people, with an average IQ of 107, let me calculate real quick. So you got that. So basically, I think we can do this. We can do this, right? So what was the claim? Let me see.
Did you know there are more people with genius IQs living in China than there are people of any kind living in the United States?
That can't possibly be true.
It is.
Who would account for that?
Well, first, an awful lot of people live in China, but here's my question. How do you distinguish yourself in a population of an awful lot of people of any kind living in the United States?
That can't possibly be true.
It is. Genius IQs living in China than there are people
Wait.
Did you know there are more people with genius IQs living in China than there are people of any kind living in the United States?
That can't possibly be true.
It is.
Who would account for that?
Well, first, an awful lot of people live in China, but here's my question. How do you distinguish yourself in a population of people who all got 1,600 on their SATs?
I didn't know they take SATs in China.
They don't. I wasn't talking about you.
Right, so the claim was that more people with genius IQ levels than there are people in the United States, right? So that would require China to have 350 million genius IQ people with genius IQ. What's defined as genius? A different definition. Some people say that's above 140. Now, if China's got an average IQ of 107, I think it's got an average IQ of 105. The USA has got an average IQ of 95. Well, the US average IQ doesn't really matter in this case. Yeah, so we can just chuck that number out. So China's got an average IQ of 107. Yeah, but the way the bell curves drop, the rapidity with which they drop once you start going beyond the median, I don't think that we've got 340 Chinese geniuses. If we had, that'd be insane. First of all, we don't even forget about China. Like, we don't even have like true geniuses. I don't think that there are more than a few million of those in the world, and that's by definition. In terms of actual outputs, actual impact, that's probably like tens of thousands of people who are genuine geniuses. Geniuses who actually have a material impact, who invent something, who discover something, who create something, right? It's probably less than 20, tens of thousands of people. Because a lot of super smart people, they tend not to be very ambitious, they tend to, yeah. Super smart, super smart. What was the point that we were trying to make here? Yeah, how we were talking about a Russian and a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and we end up talking about Chinese IQs. Yeah, my point was that there are tons of really smart Chinese people, and there would be tons of really smart Chinese people in the government, and so I'm sure that a lot of times, like probably hundreds of times, someone probably would have brought something to Xi's attention that our demographic destiny, our demographics don't look too good, right? We've got to start taking action right about now. And he's been ignoring that for the longest time. He's been ignoring a lot of the other warning signs, which tells you that he's been unchallenged. It's very difficult to question him. Remember the scene where there was this guy who was removed from the Chinese Senate, who was seen to be one of the challengers to Xi. Yeah, he does not like challengers, right? And people who are in that position, you cannot imagine people being in that position where you've got an entire country bombing. That's, well, pretty much everything that Xi do, right? I mean, he's seen to be a god. He's seen to be, like, you've got these, with Mao Zedong, you had these massive paintings, like building-sized paintings. You see the same thing with Xi Jinping. It's insane. You cannot imagine the kind of mindset, the kind of mentality that people of that sort would have. Like, they are never going to be questioned, right? So if he calls for an invasion would happen. And so eventually, through sheer brute force, and China probably would have been preparing for this kind of a thing for a long time, so they would have a ton of people in Taiwan, a ton of spies who would sabotage some of the military systems, who would cause a ton of damage to defense systems on the eve of the Chinese invasion. And I actually thought about this. We're going to talk about, I've actually done this, I haven't posted this, but this was just me talking about that because it was a fun exercise for me to think about. How would China, if I was the Chinese leader, and if I really wanted to invade Taiwan and take over Taiwan, what would I do? And so I talked about this, I created this strategy, very detailed, very in-depth, did a ton of research and created this strategy based on obviously everything that's in public. There's a ton of things that wouldn't be in public, that would be confidential, obviously, it goes without saying. But yes, I had this strategy that I think was pretty optimal, was pretty sound, pretty strategic in terms of getting the war aims. One of the things was that because China and Taiwan, they obviously got open travel, so you would start sending a lot of people, or you would start converting a lot of the people who are business travelers. You would start training them militarily. You would start converting some of them into spies, and then you would let them know that we are going to attack in tomorrow, and they need to do all of these things, right? They need to disable the systems. They need to cybersecurity kinds of things. They need to go to some of them. They would have guns, etc. They would take some really important people hostage, like military leaders and political leaders. So all sorts of things which would be the precursor to the actual invasion, which would minimize the efficacy of a Taiwanese response to the invasion, right? Both in terms of the people who could be involved in the response, because a lot of the people who could be or might have been involved have been taken hostage, and because a lot of the military faculties have been taken over by Chinese spies and saboteurs. Did I say that right? Saboteurs. I don't know how to pronounce it. I've never only read that word. I've never said that word out loud. Right. So that's how I would do it if I was China, right? And they've obviously got some super smart people working on this problem. So I'm sure that they've got some they've got some solid plans of how would we actually take over, minimizing the damage, right? So through sheer brute force and through sheer military, I mean, they invented the art of war, for God's sake. So, no matter what we think, without US intervention, because obviously US is involved in other wars in this scenario, Taiwan would be, it would be brutal, don't get me wrong, China probably would lose hundreds of thousands of people, but in the end, they would take over, they would win, and after months of brutal battles, China gains a stronghold. It's the end of Taiwan as we know it, and it becomes like Hong Kong. It becomes and China is sanctioned, but it can't be sanctioned the way Russia is, because the economic ties between China and the EU, and between China and the US, they run very deep, and there's no way to cut those ties off without both these entities, EU and US, being hurting a lot. So there are no sanctions, and so people forget about it in a matter of a few years, the way people forgot about Tibet, and the way people forgot about Hong Kong. And pretty soon everything returns back to normal, but the only difference being that instead of Taiwan, it's the Chinese who are now selling the semiconductor chips. Yeah, so that's how this might pan out. A lot of this, all of this is speculative, but based on my impressions, based on my heuristics, I think this is how things might pan out. Now, the last scenario is not how I think things might pan out. It might be. But a detailed discussion of the Taiwan scenario is for another time. I think we have spent enough time talking about different scenarios for today. It's been 57 minutes long. My throat is dry. It's time to call it quits for now. Thanks for your time. I'll see you soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.